Hello and welcome to our July third-party Roundup webinar with Syxsense. Today, we have our industry expert, John Cassell, here to give us an inside look in the newest third-party patch release. If you have any questions, please add them to the chat and John will reach out after to answer those. And with that, John Cassell.
All right. Hey, everyone. Thank you for attending today. Today, I'll be covering some of the most popular third-party products that have received updates since the start of the month. There have actually been a number of security bulletins and advisories in July, and we even have a number of zero-day exploits to cover on this webcast. It's been actually a very, very interesting month. Also, for most third-party applications, and if you've attended this webcast, you've heard this a million times before, but I always want to set this as a precursor. We have no idea when they'll actually be provided by their vendors. Most manufacturers have no guaranteed release cadence to rely on. However, Microsoft has been using the second Tuesday of the month for well over a decade now, and some manufacturers have eventually followed suit, such as Adobe, and we'll see that there have actually been a few interesting release situations with Adobe when we get into the updates. Let's briefly discuss, however, what a vulnerability is versus what is a patch or what an update per se does. A vulnerability is a bug or misconfiguration in a product, application, or operating system that, if exploited, allows that product or system to be compromised by an attacker. A patch or an update is not the same thing. It's instead a piece of software or code published by the vendor of that product or system to resolve the vulnerability. With that being said, though, not all vulnerabilities can be patched, and not all patches resolve vulnerabilities. If a vulnerability exists in a product or system, but no patch or workaround is available, then the vulnerability is considered a zero-day exploit. And there are a few other tags or classifications that we'll be looking at when it comes to prioritizing. Again, before we get into the latest updates, how do we prioritize? There are multiple strategies out there, but here at Syxsense, we focus on 6 different factors. If you've attended our Patch Tuesday webcast with Rob Brown, he goes through these same exact 6 factors as well. The first is vendor severity, and this is going to typically range from critical to non-applicable. Many third-party vendors do not talk about their product in any negative light, so we may not actually get anything. And it comes again directly from the manufacturer of that update. It is, however, important to always check their severity or priority. They might sometimes word it, but do again bear in mind that it can be very much biased. Many third-party updates don't receive severities from those manufacturers. Again, it would highlight that product in a very negative light. We'll actually be looking at a few examples of vendor priority today, especially with Adobe being one of the manufacturers that do set their own priority. And it's, again, been a very interesting month for them. To combat the bias around vendor severity, we instead prioritize the industry severity more. We recommend it, such as the CVSS or Common Vulnerability Scoring System, calculated by an independent organization. This ensures that all manufacturers are standardized. It typically ranges from 0 to 10, with the highest number 10 being the most severe and critical. And by the way, the next 4 areas typically do, or 3 actually of the 4, do typically get counted in terms of the CVSS score. So we'll talk on a few of them that are on the screen, especially weaponization, publicly aware, and countermeasures. They will actually typically correlate with the higher CVSS score. We then deal with the state of the vulnerability, such as, is it being weaponized? Is it being actively exploited? This means that it can affect any individual or environment at this exact moment by sophisticated attacks. So there's actually proof out there that the vulnerability has been exploited. When vulnerabilities become publicly disclosed, it means that the structure or the blueprint of said bug has been exposed to the industry. And this, again, typically is going to increase the score for said vulnerability because now we know how to hack it. Now we know how to exploit that across any systems out there. Not that we want to, but of course, for bad actors, it makes it much easier for them. For anyone else as well to hop on the bandwagon and start exploiting. Doesn't necessarily that it's mean that it's being exploited, though, but that those details are out there on how to weaponize. These are typically published by bug bounty programs, independent researchers, sometimes the manufacturer, believe it or not. So it is something to always keep in mind. We also have a separation of what we would consider a zero-day exploit to look at today, as well as the proof of concept, meaning publicly disclosed, from one of the manufacturers. Countermeasures are also a possibility that are provided in two different ways, either mitigation, such as a configuration from an antivirus or EDR that is stopping the vulnerability in its tracks without urgently deploying, say, a formal patch. And the other countermeasure is a workaround, such as a registry, policy, or service configuration change that also prevents the vulnerability from being exploited. A great example of this is when Microsoft provides a recommended policy or registry change, typically in a post-patching scenario. We saw that actually this month. Won't be discussing it too much on this webcast, but it has been discussed on our Patch Tuesday webcast around the vulnerability 2023-36884, where it was a post-patching scenario of a remote code execution vulnerability not resolved by a patch, but instead an extra mitigation, or sorry, workaround was provided. There's a difference there. Finally, the sixth factor in determining our strategy is the exposure. And this breakdown is based on what tool or solutions being used to detect and report on outstanding vulnerabilities across your fleet. Every environment is different and typically includes various versions of operating systems. So knowing, of course, where said vulnerabilities exist allow us to better target our endpoints for remediation. And I'm not just simply talking about your conventional vulnerability scanner. You're not going to get much resolution or remediation out of that, but instead the SecOps team is going to provide that report over to IT, usually traditionally, based on scale, based on the size of the business. But we want to detect, but then as well, we want to pipe that data into our deployment mechanism. So how can we deploy, say, dynamically? All right, so third-party products we'll be discussing today have all received updates since the month started and all resolve, again, some sort of vulnerability. There are a lot of other updates out there. We'll generally talk about them, but we want to focus on the security side of things. And there again have been some dreaded zero-day exploits. Also, I always want to mention something that sets my priority. All products have had advisories from the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency to update as soon as possible. First, Adobe dropped several updates for Windows, Mac OS, and cloud services. This month, they only patched two of their products, Cold Fusion and InDesign. However, this was definitely no normal month, as mentioned earlier. First, though, and a normal release for Adobe InDesign users. It received an update to resolve 12 separate vulnerabilities, ranging from 5.5 to 7.8 CVSS scores. These predominantly include out-of-bounds read issues, with only one critical out-of-bounds write bug, and the rest are all rated as simply important. That's the vendor severity. The industry severity, again, is based on that CVSS score. The Adobe vendor advisory, as well, that comes along with it, and again, every vendor does things a little bit differently. Their vendor advisory for InDesign was standard, as they stamped it simply with a lesser priority of 3. And for Adobe's scale, the higher the number on their priority, the better. It means there's nothing to prioritize as much. Just patch it when you can. And it also typically correlates with it being far less likely to exploit. This update was not actually what made this month interesting again, but instead the multiple releases for Adobe Cold Fusion. First, on July 11th, which was their typical expected release, they released a Priority 1 update for Cold Fusion to resolve 3 security issues, with one tracked as CVE, read from my notes, 2023-29298, having been exploited in the wild. This vulnerability stems from improper access control, and if exploited, could lead to security feature bypass. It's been given a critical rating as well from Adobe and has a CVSS score of actually only 7.5. Although in this release of Cold Fusion, another bug dealing with deserialization of untrusted data has actually a higher CVSS score, meaning critical, of 9.8, so near the top of the scale. Just 3 days later, Adobe released another update for Cold Fusion to resolve another deserialization of untrusted data vulnerability with a CVSS score of 9.8. This vulnerability is tracked as 2023-38203 and has not been recognized as exploited in the wild, but instead Adobe stated that they are aware of a proof of concept blog being posted for it. So far, I've actually talked about pretty much 4 of those main factors, as mentioned earlier, from just simply one manufacturer's release. Adobe provides their vendor severity in 2 different ways. They provide their rating of each vulnerability solved or fixed with every release. They have their overall advisory, which they call priority. We talked about the CVSS scores for a few so far. We're not even done yet. And then we also saw publicly disclosed. And as well, everything that kind of piped into that was the 4th area where they have talked about exploits in the wild. So again, very interesting month. Hate to say it, I like reading these. Of course, unfortunate for my audience if you happen to be using these products, but very interesting release this month. The additional Cold Fusion release a few days later is also has another vendor priority of 1, meaning that again, it is at the top of the scale for Adobe, or bottom because they reversed it. It is their highest priority. Lastly, 5 days later on July 19th, another update dropped for Cold Fusion to resolve yet another 0-day exploit, as well as 2 security fixes. The exploited vulnerability is, in this case, is tracked as CVE 2023-38205 and is related to improper access control, and if exploited, leads to security feature bypass. It's been given a critical severity and a CVSS score of, again, simply 7.5. But once again, Adobe stamped the release with the highest priority of 1 because of it being exploited. Given that the Adobe products had multiple security advisories, or critical advisories, I should say, the highest vendor severity you'll see from Adobe, which is not typical in any way, multiple exploits in the wild, and a proof of concept has been disclosed, these fixes should not be overlooked, and any affected Adobe users should prioritize patching immediately. There's far too much risk, especially for Cold Fusion users, to not drop what they're doing and patch. Make sure that you are doing that if it happens to apply. So moving on, one that we have always enjoyed discussing in previous calls, and I'm sure everyone's heard about it. It's obviously the most popular browser out there, Google Chrome. It has had 2 desktop releases, which is not typical. We usually see more in a given month, but it's been an interesting month for a lot of these products across Windows, macOS, and Linux systems for the month of July. Our first update dropped on July 18th and resolved 20 security issues, with 4 rated as high severity and another 6 rated as medium. Some of the fixes include use after free issues in WebRTC and tab groups, as well as out-of-bounds memory access in Mojo, inappropriate implementation across multiple modules, and insufficient validation of untrusted input in themes. Google also forked out $34,000 US in bug bounties for 11 of the issues that were provided by external researchers. Great news this past month for Chrome users as well, no 0-day exploits to highlight. Looking back, 2021 was a very, very tough year for Google Chrome users as the browser had 16 0-day exploits in that calendar year. Last year in 2022, there were 9. We're well past midway this year. We've got 5 months left in 2023, and so far we're still only looking at 3 0 days. So again, it's looking much better, much healthier, and I at least hope it continues that way. Moving on, another update for Chrome dropped on July 20th. However, not much to provide. Sometimes they will drop a stable release, but we won't have much information provided by the manufacturer. So no security fixes to highlight, but it does still apply to Windows, Mac, and Linux users. So you might see that update drop, especially if you got automatic updates there, or as well if you happen to be using a distribution mechanism. I hinted at it earlier, but I say this every month. Chrome is by far the most popular web browser, and it's even leveraged in many other browsers you might be using that are Chromium-based. That, of course, makes it a malicious attacker's preferred target. Regarding updating it, as always, the browser should it should auto-update for any consumers, but be sure to double check and update accordingly, especially if any end users do not have administrative rights to their devices. Also remember that I mentioned this last month. If you're still using Chrome on older Windows Server versions of 2012, it is unsupported after October of this year. I'd personally recommend to just ditch the browser as soon as possible. I don't know, many of them be using Chrome on a server, especially one that might be a sensitive device or mission critical. but do make sure that you find an alternative before it's too late. Following suit, any vulnerabilities resolved in Chrome also affect other Chromium-based browsers, such as the increasingly popular Microsoft Edge. Edge received 5 updates since the month started. The July 10th update only fixed some various bugs and performance issues. Once again, and I typically see this from Microsoft for Edge. Unfortunately for my role, they don't really supply much detail on what the update includes. However, for some that are going to include more details, they usually provide us with some more information. Like the July 13th release, just a few days later, instead resolved 3 Edge-specific vulnerabilities. So we know that it's leveraging the Chromium code, but it is a separate application, and sometimes Microsoft will include fixes for other vulnerabilities that apply just to Edge. The first is tracked as CVE 2023-36883 and is specific actually to iOS users and related to iOS spoofing. It has a lower CVSS score of 4.3, and Microsoft claims that exploitation is fortunately less likely. The second vulnerability is tracked as 2023-36887 and is related to remote code execution. It does, however, have a higher CVSS score of 7.8, but Microsoft also claims it's less likely to exploit. The last vulnerability specific to Edge is tracked as 2023-36888 and applies to Microsoft Edge for Android regarding a tampering vulnerability. It instead has a CVSS score midway about 6.3. Microsoft said it's less likely, to be exploited. And if it is, performance can be interrupted and or reduced, but the attacker cannot fully deny service. Moving on, the next Edge release dropped on July 17th with minor fixes. And then the July 21st release is our expected monthly feature drop. This release includes 8 new policies, 1 policy change, and a new service for administrators called Edge Management Service. Edge Management Service is an area of the Microsoft 365 Admin Center where admins can manage the Edge browser, according to Microsoft's release notes. Quote unquote, it's a simple and easy to manage experience. Admins are able to configure all, well, not end quote, I guess I'm still going, to configure all Microsoft Edge browser policies for their organization in a configuration profile and set up the browser to use the settings, end quote. Microsoft stated they'll be rolling out the experience starting on the 20th of July, and they said that it should last until next week. We're in that next week, so it should be ending sometime this week. The release as well included fixes for an additional 3 Edge-specific vulnerabilities. The first is tracked as 2023-35392 and is again related to spoofing, although not against a specific operating system, it's general Edge. It has a lower score of 4.7 and less likely for exploitation. The next one is tracked as 2023-38173 and is another update for Android users regarding spoofing. So if it applies to you, you've got 2 actually, you should be updating. Hopefully it's updating itself, but be sure. It additionally has a lower CVSS score of 4.3, has not been publicly disclosed, and exploitation is again less likely. Lastly, CVE 2023-38187 is related to elevation of privilege. It has a higher CVSS score of 6.5, but again is less likely to exploit. All 3 of the fixes hit the stable as well as extended stable channels of Microsoft Edge. Given that multiple Edge-specific vulnerabilities are clearly present and all other Chromium high-severity fixes mentioned previously still apply, I do recommend to prioritize the newest versions when you get a chance. Not as popular these days, but it's one of my preferred browsers. I like to kind of diversify my browsers for different roles and applications that I'm accessing. Mozilla Firefox. They released only 3 updates since last month, including an additional update for extended support release users. They first dropped a Firefox update on July 4th, bringing Firefox to version 1.15. It included 4 high-severity fixes out of a total of 13 separate CVEs. So that's actually a slightly larger release than what we've seen in previous months. I also want to mention the biggest thing actually in this release is that Firefox 1.15, let me rephrase that, Firefox 1.15 for Windows 7 and Windows 8 users, as well as Mac OS Sierra, High Sierra, and Mojave, It'll no longer receive, those devices will no longer receive the main channel updates going forward. So I would be a little concerned if you're on an old version anyways, given that you're running unsupported Microsoft or Mac products or Apple products per se. But if you do happen to continue, they are going to roll you into the extended support release versions so that you can at least continue to receive important security updates. But you won't receive anything new. Your browser's locked in time. Moving on, Firefox version 115.0.1 simply resolved a startup crash for Windows users with Kingsoft antivirus installed, and version 115.0.2, which I typically see in the sub revisions, are not much to highlight, but I thought it was interesting. There was actually an additional security fix for a high severity use after free exploit in the workers engine. So definitely don't overlook those sub release versions, no matter what product or vendor we're talking about. Something else out there could, of course, be exploited. Although it's clearly not as popular as Chrome to exploit, this month included some of those high severity fixes, and if you do happen to be using Firefox, update as soon as possible. Lastly, and we don't talk about this month after month, we are going to see it only a few times throughout the year, Oracle's quarterly July critical patch update advisory dropped on the 18th, and it included 9 fixes specifically for Java, out of a total 508 total security patches for all of Oracle's patched products. The highest CVSS base score of vulnerabilities affecting Java is 5.9, so actually a relatively minor release, but there were a number of fixes. And 8 of them, actually, this is the most concerning, 8 of the vulnerabilities may be remotely exploitable without authentication, i.e. they may be exploited over a network without requiring user credentials according to Oracle's website. Any other Java-based products, such as Amazon Corretto, will also be affected by these vulnerabilities, and you'll also want to make sure you update as soon as possible. Of course, for this webcast, I'm only highlighting Java's update specifically, but of course, any other Oracle products are to be updated in this quarterly advisory. I strongly urge anyone using Oracle products in general to check the advisory and update where necessary. Some additional products that we've seen updates since the last month, and none of these really to focus on any security issues per se. Bitwarden, Dropbox, FileZilla, Foxit Reader, Jenkins, Malwarebytes, Microsoft Power BI, Opera, Skype, Snagit, TeamViewer, VirtualBox, VMware Horizon, WebEx, Wireshark, and Zoom. My monthly reminder, and I've heard this many times before, reminder to all administrators, please include third-party patching in your patch deployment process. Any and all applications installed can be considered a potential vulnerability. I haven't heard or seen the newest percentage of the last couple of years, but at some point around 2019, 2020, operating system updates were only roughly 20% of all the vulnerabilities out there. So clearly there are a lot of others that could affect devices that would be, of course, applications installed on that OS. Before we go, it was another really, really bad month for Apple and Apple users directly, as nearly all products were given update advisories in the middle of the month to resolve multiple actively exploited bugs across macOS, iOS, iPadOS, tvOS, watchOS, and Safari. This is also the second time that Apple has leveraged their rapid security response process since adopting it earlier this year in May. I should also note that Apple completely botched their first push on July 10th, as many macOS, iOS, and iPadOS users immediately reported getting errors when accessing websites through Safari. They quickly confirmed, Apple did, that the patches were preventing some websites from displaying properly, and they pulled the updates. 2 days later, on July 12th, Apple re-released the updates for macOS Ventura specifically, iOS and iPadOS 16 specifically users, as well as they included a fix for the website issue. Going back to the 0 days though, the first is a WebKit flaw tracked as CVE 2023-37450, where processing web content may lead to arbitrary code execution. This was reported by an anonymous researcher, and the issue was addressed with improved checks. As mentioned earlier, this exists in macOS Ventura, as well as iOS and iPadOS versions 16. Fast forward to yesterday, Apple drops updates across nearly all products to resolve some additional zero-day exploits, as well as one that was discovered back in May that we had talked about on a previous webcast. The next exploit is a kernel flaw tracked as CVE 2023-38606, where an app may be able to modify sensitive kernel state, and Apple credited 5 different Kaspersky researchers with reporting this issue. This bug applies to all supported versions of macOS, iOS, iPadOS, tvOS, and watchOS. I also read that it's the second time Apple has pushed out fixes for software defects exploited as part of APT-style attacks on Kaspersky's corporate network. Kaspersky's disclosure came on the same day that Russia's Federal Security Service blamed U.S. intelligence agencies for an ongoing spy campaign targeting thousands of iOS devices belonging to domestic subscribers and foreign diplomatic missions. So kind of interesting. You might want to look that up. There's quite a story behind it. The third and final exploit is tracked as CVE 2023-32409, and it was actually disclosed earlier this year in May, and we discussed it on a previous webcast as mentioned earlier. The third bug was specific only to iOS and iPadOS versions 15, and was reported by Google's Threat Analysis Group, as well as Amnesty International's Security Lab. Apple stated that they, again, are aware of a report that this issue may have been actively exploited, and as well for all the flaws mentioned today. And mentioned this before, I know that Apple doesn't really count as a third-party product, but I wanted to make sure that it was covered on this webcast, again, for the 5th month to inform my macOS audience, since this additional advisory does address some pretty serious zero-day issues. And of course, for any other third-party products on Apple devices, be sure to check your app store and update accordingly. I hope that this has been informative and useful to everybody. And if you enjoy the form of the webcast or not, please contact us and let us know. Every day, the Syxsense team identifies, classifies, and pre-checks various patches and vulnerabilities that affect common endpoints on servers. To get a full listing of all the versions or various issues that may impact your environment, be sure to check our website under resources. You'll see a link to the vulnerability database. What I love about it is that the vulnerability library is not just only to discuss levels of impact like everybody else, but we also offer recommendations and resolutions to every issue. If you have any further questions, concerns, or suggestions for improvement, we would love to hear it. Thanks for your time and happy patching.